Asterisk today, I want to share why life in Canada feels different for Australians. Even when everything seems familiar at first. Asterisk, the difference announces itself quietly. Canada does not confront Australians with dramatic unfamiliarity, but with an atmosphere that feels unexpectedly muted. The streets appear orderly, conversations measured, emotions carefully regulated. On the surface, the shared language and Western norms suggest easy alignment, yet beneath that familiarity, the distinct emotional temperature that Australians consistently notice. Life in Canada feels slower in its reactions, softer in its expressions, and more restrained in how people occupy public space. Early impressions often center on the tone of daily interactions. Australians commonly observe that Canadian social life operates with a careful politeness that borders on distance. Greetings are friendly but contained. Humor is present, but rarely sharp or teasing. Where Australian social exchanges tend to rely on informality, sarcasm, and rapid emotional shifts, Canadian interactions feel smoother and more controlled. There is less verbal interruption, fewer overt challenges, and a noticeable effort to keep conversations neutral and agreeable. The physical environment reinforces this impression. Canadian cities feel structured and intentional, shaped by systems designed to minimize friction. Cues are respected, rules are followed without comment. Public behavior reflects a collective agreement to avoid disruption. Australians, accustomed to a more relaxed relationship with authority and a tolerance for mild disorder, often sense an underlying seriousness in how Canada organizes everyday life. Even leisure spaces carry an air of regulation, as if enjoyment itself is expected to remain within certain boundaries. This contrast extends into communication styles. In Australia, directness is often softened with humor, and blunt observations are normalized through irony. In Canada, clarity is filtered through caution. Opinions are framed diplomatically, disagreement is carefully signposted, and emotional intensity is moderated. Australians frequently notice that conversations avoid extremes, favoring balance over conviction. This can create an impression of emotional flatness, not because feelings are absent, but because they are deliberately managed. Workplace culture highlights these differences further. Canadians tend to approach professional environments with a strong emphasis on consensus and procedural fairness. Hierarchies exist, but they are understated, and confrontation is minimized. Australians, more comfortable with informal authority and open critique, may find Canadian workplaces quieter and less expressive. Initiative is encouraged, but only within clearly defined expectations. Risk is assessed carefully, and boldness is often tempered by the need for group alignment. Social inclusion follows similar patterns. Canadians are welcoming, but access unfolds gradually. Friendships develop through consistency rather than intensity. Australians, used to rapid social bonding and casual familiarity, may perceive this as emotional distance. Invitations are polite, but boundaries remain intact. Personal details are shared selectively, and intimacy grows slowly, built on trust rather than immediacy. Over time, these patterns reveal deeper cultural values at work. Canada prioritizes social stability, emotional safety, and predictability. Harmony is maintained through restraint, and public life is shaped by unspoken agreement to reduce friction wherever possible. For Australians, whose cultural instincts favor openness, adaptability, and emotional elasticity, this creates a subtle but persistent sense of adjustment, one that reshapes how connection, expression, and belonging are understood. Asterisk, this emphasis on restraint also shapes how conflict is handled. In Canada, disagreement tends to be absorbed rather than expressed. Tension is diffused through careful language, pauses, and indirect cues. Australians often notice that issues linger beneath the surface longer than expected, unresolved but quietly contained. Where Australian culture tends to externalize friction, addressing it openly, sometimes bluntly, Canadian culture often internalizes it, prioritizing emotional equilibrium over immediate resolution. The result is a social environment that feels calm, but occasionally opaque. Emotional expression follows the same logic. Displays of strong feeling, whether enthusiasm or frustration, are subtly moderated. Excitement is expressed politely. Anger is softened into concern. Even joy appears measured, shared without demanding attention. Australians, coming from a culture where emotional range is more visibly expressed and socially accepted, may initially interpret this as emotional distance or reserve. Over time, it becomes clear that the difference lies not in depth of feeling, but in the cultural rules governing its display. Seasonal rhythms further influence this dynamic. Canada's long winter shape both daily behavior and social psychology. Public life contracts inward. Routines become more structured, and planning replaces spontaneity. Australians, accustomed to climates that encourage outdoor social life and casual interaction year-round, often feel this shift acutely. Social gatherings become smaller, scheduled, and intentional. The environment itself seems to encourage introspection and self-containment, reinforcing the cultural preference for order and predictability. Even humor reflects this contrast. Australian humor frequently relies on exaggeration, self-deprecation, and playful confrontation. It thrives on testing boundaries and deflating status. In Canada, humor is gentler, more situational, and less likely to challenge directly. Australians may notice that jokes are carefully calibrated to avoid discomfort, and teasing is softened or avoided altogether. What feels like harmless banter in Australia can feel intrusive in Canada, revealing different assumptions about social closeness and emotional tolerance. These differences become most apparent in moments of uncertainty or stress. Canadians tend to respond by seeking institutional solutions, policies, procedures, and collective agreements. Trust in systems plays a central role in maintaining social confidence. Australians, more inclined to rely on improvisation and personal networks, may find this reliance on structure both reassuring and limiting. The expectation that systems will function smoothly reduces visible anxiety, but also narrows the space for individual deviation. Gradually, many Australians observe a shift in their own behavior. Conversations become more measured. Emotional reactions are tempered. Social risk-taking declines. This is not a conscious decision, but an adaptation to the surrounding environment. The cultural signal is clear. Stability is valued, predictability is respected, and emotional moderation is rewarded. What begins as observation slowly becomes participation, reshaping how daily life is navigated within this quieter social landscape. Asterisk as these adjustments settle in, the broader emotional climate of life in Canada becomes clearer. The culture promotes steadiness over intensity, smoothing emotional highs and lows into a more even rhythm. For Australians, accustomed to visible energy and expressive fluctuation, this calm can feel both comforting and subtly limiting. Days unfold with fewer emotional spikes, guided by unspoken preference for balance and predictability. This atmosphere influences how identity is shaped. In Australia, identity is often reinforced through presence and social dynamism. In Canada, it is more closely tied to consistency and reliability. Being steady carries greater value than being expressive. Australians may notice that reinvention is quieter here, and progress is measured through continuity rather than momentum. Public conversation reflects the same restraint. Social and political discussions tend to emphasize moderation, with strong positions softened by careful language. Urgency is moderated in favor of cohesion. Australians often sense that emotional intensity is intentionally reduced, not out of indifference, but from a belief that stability protects the collective environment. Belonging, in this context, develops gradually. Trust is built through repetition and respect for boundaries rather than immediacy. What may initially feel like distance slowly reveals itself as a form of quiet commitment. Over time, many Australians find that relationships become dependable, if less emotionally vivid. The transformation is subtle but persistent. Language becomes softer, reactions more measured, spontaneity less frequent. Life grows calmer, more controlled. Canada's difference ultimately lies not in dramatic contrast, but in tone. It offers Australians a way of living shaped by moderation and emotional care and environment that feels unfamiliar at first, yet increasingly understandable with time.